Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning and for bearing through the complications. Welcome to Belize. This is what it's like. For those of you who don't know us, my name is Sarah McCarthy.
I'm Angelia.
And as you can see, Angie's still in Belize representing us. So maybe you'll hear a tropical bird or a roasted drum in the background, and hopefully that will only enhance the experience. So our project was based on exploring pathways to sustainable agriculture in Maya communities in southern Belize. And this was not only a master's research project, it was a fellowship project through the Center for Collaborative Conservation. So through this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about our fellows team. We're going to talk about our partnering organization, Yashe Conservation Trust. We're going to give you a quick background of the ecological and social aspect of this conservation issue. And we're going to go through the multiple components of this project, including a discussion of the broader theories and conservation literature, and talk a little bit about the many lessons that we learned during our time in this project. So last December, Angie and I worked with Jen and with two members of a local nonprofit in Belize, Lee McLaughlin and Kenny Cowell, to write a proposal to the CCC, the Center for Collaborative Conservation, for a fellows project. And after excitingly receiving that fellows project, we worked together to further develop our objectives and figure out how are we going to actually reach these objectives through stakeholder analyses and starting to dive into the literature concerning the issue. And this was all in preparation for Angie and I to head down to Belize in May to work with Yashe Conservation Trust, our partner organization.
So there's a little bit of a lag, I think, when you change slides, Sarah.
Okay.
So please tell me when you've moved to the next slide, then I can start talking.
Okay.
All right, so Yashe Conservation Trust is our partner organization here in Belize. Their vision is to create harmony between nature and human development for the benefit of both. So they're really understanding the complex conservation issues that include social and ecological aspects. It began in 1997 by local Maya leaders, and it's really working to promote the holistic use of the landscape that it's working to protect, the Maya golden landscape, which we'll look at in a few slides. Not only are they working to promote conservation of the Maya golden landscape, they're also working very closely with the indigenous communities that are surrounding those areas, because they understand that those indigenous communities are relying heavily on the resources from those protected areas, and they were relying on those resources before those areas were protected. So because it has this social and ecological side to the organization, there's actually two separate teams within Yashe Conservation Trust. There's the Community Outreach and Livelihoods team, which works very closely with farmers and in schools and other community organizations throughout the area that they're working. And they're really promoting sustainable practices and creating awareness of those protected areas. And they also have the Protected Areas Management team, which focuses more on the ecological aspects. They're looking at biodiversity monitoring, they're looking at doing ranger patrols to look at legal activities that are happening within the protected areas, and the management or co-management of some of these areas that Yashe is working in. Could you move to the next slide, Sarah? So the ecological aspects of this area are, it's about 770,000 acres, and it has multiple protected areas located within the Maya golden landscape. So as you can see, there are many areas that Yashe is co-managing, and these areas have many different levels of protection. So, for example, Bladen Nature Reserve is one of the highest levels of protection, and the only people that are allowed to go in there are for science or research and education visits. The communities that are surrounding that area aren't supposed to go into that area for extraction of resources. One of the reasons why this area is so important is because it's one of the last remaining corridors between the Maya Mountains and the Mesoamerican Reef, which is the second largest barrier reef in the world. And so if there are illegal activities or pollution of the watershed up by the mountains, and that pollution can really affect the Mesoamerican Reef down at the bottom of the watershed. And so this is very crucial for the protection of a wildlife corridor, but also the Mesoamerican Reef down below. So to give you an idea of how biodiverse this area might be, there are over 80 species classified as endangered by the IUCN. And so within this area, there are a few different groups of indigenous people. There are the Quechua Maya and Mopan Maya. And these two groups are descendants from the Maya civilization that spread throughout Mexico and Central America. We focus mostly in communities that were Quechua Maya, and with Indian Creek specifically was a Quechua Maya community. These communities have their own governing system, so they have alcaldes or village chiefs, which are the governing bodies of these communities, and they also have a chairperson that focuses on the development of the community. The community that we focused in for our research was Indian Creek community. This community was founded in 1969 by 4 founding families that came from surrounding areas, and their primary language is Quechua Maya. From those 4 families that founded this community in 1969, it has grown to about 174 households.
All right. So these Maya people have, for centuries, practiced agriculture as a main part of their livelihood. And still today, it remains a key component of their culture and tradition. And predominantly, the agriculture method that's practiced is called milpa, also known as slash and burn, which is how we will refer to it in this presentation. And slash and burn is a form of agriculture in which a heavily vegetated area is cleared, and then that felled vegetation is burned in preparation for farming. And traditionally, this this land will be used for harvesting for a few years, and then the land will lay fallow or lay still for 12 to 15 years. And this fallow period is really the key to the sustainability of this practice, because during this period, the soil has time to regenerate and the nutrients have time to reaccumulate, and the vegetation, as you can probably imagine, in the tropics grows much faster than in eastern Colorado. So recently, with population growth and with land tenure limitations, this fallow period has been reduced. So there was a study in 1998 in the Toledo district where we were working that was showing that on average, the farmers were only practicing a 5-year fallow period. And that was in 1998. So we can only assume with the trajectory that this has since been reduced. So the issue with this, the reduction of this fallow period, is that the farmers are pressured to use chemical inputs, pesticides, fertilizers in the land, and are also pressured to search for more fertile land, which are usually primary or secondary forests in this area. So this chemical input and the clearing of forests, as you can all imagine and as you all know, leads to many issues within the watershed and the ecosystem, such as pollution of the waterways, soil destabilization, the clearing of forests, leading to eventually exacerbation of climate change. So Yashe Conservation Trust is working to find a solution to this ecological issue. However, Yashe knows that this is not just an ecological issue. They understand that the agriculture of these lands is deeply connected to the livelihoods of the people. So Yashe is trying to find a solution and work towards a solution that works both for the benefit of the ecosystems and the people that depend upon them. And that brings us to cacao-based agroforestry. So Yashe is promoting a few sustainable agriculture practices. However, our project was solely based on cacao-based agroforestry. So what is agroforestry? Agroforestry generally is the incorporation of a diversity of species, mainly woody species, onto a farming plot. And this emulates the forest structure, which in turn reaps benefits similar to that of an intact forest. Now, cacao-based agroforestry specifically is the incorporation of theobroma cacao, all of our favorite dessert, chocolate, into the landscape. So there are many benefits that have been researched in the past few decades of agroforestry. Angie knows I could talk about this for a long time, so I'm going to try to make it brief. But I get really excited about it. First of all, the soil stabilization. So when you're incorporating a diversity of plants on a landscape, you have the tap roots, you have the lateral roots, and you have the detritus that is decomposing. And this is creating a really rich soil profile that's great for farming and great for soil biodiversity. As far as the organisms that live in the soil. Nutrient cycling, as I mentioned previously, that detritus that's falling is creating that natural cycle, eliminating the need for fertilizer inputs, or reducing them at least. And as far as the levels of biodiversity, agroforestry works on two levels. One is the local level on the plot. If you're incorporating a diversity of species, there's obviously going to be higher levels of biodiversity. But definitely more importantly, is the landscape level biodiversity. Imagine a forested area with 5 acres of monocrop corn plot in the center. This is creating a fragmented habitat, and if the farmer utilizes agroforestry techniques where they're emulating the natural forest, this creates a zone that is similar to the surrounding habitat. So especially in this area, the Maya Golden landscape, that Angie was talking about earlier, it's really important that large mammals, birds, and small mammals can go through this corridor. So agroforestry plats add that. Along with the ecological benefits, there are many social benefits. Diet diversification, as you can imagine, the farmers are eating what they are growing, possibly on the farm. Income diversification, there was a study done in the Toledo district in 2005 that showed that cacao farmers were actually accruing just as much income as other farmers and other incomes in the region. There's also a theory that if poverty is reduced, in this case through the selling of a cash crop, then maybe there is more space for an increase in altruism, and maybe that will lead to an increase of conservation actions. Now, this is just a theory, and it is controversial, but I thought that I would bring it up. And just to note, we're talking about all of these benefits of agroforestry, but as with any cash crop, if the crop is grown in a monoculture, much like citrus and bananas in Belize, it's going to only add to the issue. So we are specifically talking about cacao-based agroforestry, which is a diversity of crops within the system. So this project overall is intended to explore a transition towards a more sustainable farming practice. And we had a few objectives throughout this project. Our first one was to understand, is there interest? Do farmers actually want to adopt these practices? And if so, what are the barriers that they're facing? We also wanted to be able to facilitate a discussion between people who are already pursuing this successfully and the farmers in southern Belize. Thirdly, we also wanted to understand how to monitor these plots. How do we actually set up a study to understand the differences in the levels of biodiversity between agroforestry plots and slash and burn plots? And finally, we wanted to be able to share our experiences and our knowledge with the local and international conservation communities. All right, Angie.
So this project had a few different deliverables. There were ecological deliverables as well as social deliverables. Some of the ecological deliverables included a literature review. So Sarah and I had the opportunity to study the effects that agroforestry had on ecosystems and compare that to the effects that slash and burn had on ecosystems. We took that information and we created the best practices for monitoring biodiversity levels within agriculture plots, specifically cacao-based agroforestry. And then we took that literature review and we created another deliverable that was a draft monitoring protocol. So currently Yashe is doing biodiversity monitoring in the protected areas that they manage. And so we had the opportunity to try and expand that monitoring protocol to include agroforestry plots and potentially slash and burn plots in the future. So we provided recommendations on the study design, stratification of the data. Yashe is currently focusing mostly on bird and mammal monitoring within their protected areas. So we focused on bird and mammals, and then we also brought up capacity and how much money Yashe would need in order to implement this plan. And I have some news for everyone. Yashe currently has a grant running that will actually implement the plan that Sarah and I produced. So hopefully we get some plots set out soon and you can see how the study design works. And I will be down here and hopefully I can make recommendations for any changes that need to happen.
All right, and you can find that literature review and the biodiversity monitoring protocol recommendations in our supplemental materials packet. So, to reach another one of our objectives, we facilitated an international cross-cultural knowledge exchange. So, there's a group of farmers in northern central Guatemala called the Washaktun Forestry Concession Leaders. And for the past few decades, they have been successfully managing a forest concession project. And we brought them in and had them spend a weekend with the farmers in southern Belize, sharing knowledge, having discussions, and just learning about each other's work and successes and learning from each other's mistakes. And this was really interesting for us. We were able to listen to Quechua Maya being translated into Spanish, being translated into English, and listen to these really engaging discussions between these farmers, learning from each other. And our farmers in southern Belize were asking really incredible questions. How are you managing this? Where are the profits going? What happens when somebody's not cooperating? And during this time, I remember thinking just like, this is so CLTL. It was a very gratifying part of the project. These are just a few snapshots. Angie and I were able to present our preliminary results from our survey. We crossed a few cold rivers, got our shoes wet. I accidentally said a bad word in Spanish when I was trying to say shoe. We ate some delicious Maya food and had a really good time together and learned a lot together. All right, Angie.
All right, so one of the biggest deliverables of this project, and the one that Sarah and I probably spent the most time on here in Belize, was developing a baseline survey for Yashe. So the survey had a few different objectives. Not only was it aimed towards getting information for our research, but it was also going to be used as a baseline survey for Yashe to conduct every 2 to 3 years in the communities that they work with in the Maya Golden landscape. And so these objectives capture the multiple different people that were involved in the creation of this. So the first objective was to understand what methods are currently being practiced in these communities. And because it's going to be conducted every 2 to 3 years, the changing of these practices can be tracked over time. So we can see if slash and burn is being practiced less and less, and if more sustainable practices are being practiced more and more. This was produced by the Community Outreach and Livelihoods team, and so one of the things that they were really interested in is whether the farmers understood the benefits of the ecosystems that they were living close to, and if they had that connection of how their farming practices might affect those ecosystems. And then also the objective for our research was to better understand the barriers of adopting more sustainable practices, such as cacao-based agroforestry. So it was quite the process. It was a very fun and uplifting and enjoyable process most of the time. So Sarah and I spent about 2 months working with the Community Outreach and Livelihoods team in developing questions, setting those objectives, making sure that each question met one of those objectives. Once we felt like the survey was as good as it was going to get, we went out to pilot the survey. We went out to 12 different farmers within the Maya Golden Landscape in about 5 or 6 different communities. We excluded Indian Creek because that was the community that we were going to be conducting the survey in. So here you can see us doing piloting in 2 different communities, Cacao and Cacao. And this was a very important step in the process. This allowed us to see if there were any questions that were confusing, the farmers weren't able to answer, maybe they felt that it was too sensitive of a question they didn't want to answer. So it allowed us to amend any of those questions that needed amending throughout the process. The next step in the process was a training workshop. So the interesting thing about this survey was it was going to be written in English, and then it was going to be translated into the local indigenous language, Quechua Maya, which is the primary language of the community members that we were working with. And then it had to be back translated into English so that Sarah and I could analyze the data later. And so we had to make sure that the questions that we had could be translated into Quechua. One of the things that we ran into was the word environment doesn't have a direct translation in Quechua. That environmental awareness section, we had to kind of split into different sets of questions so that it could be easily translated. So we hired 2 bilingual community members, our survey conductors, in order to do this process for us. And during this training workshop, we did translations into Quechua and then back translations into English. And we also practiced the translation of each of these questions by the 2 survey conductors to make sure that they were each translating the question the same way. So we decided on all the translations for all the questions in our 6-page survey. It took a while, but it was an extremely important part of the process. So after we did this training, we sent our surveyors off, and they had the opportunity to go into the community and get acquainted with the community members. One of our survey conductors was from Indian Creek, the other was not, and so I think it was very beneficial for her to go out into the community and be able to meet with some of the farmers and just let them know what they were going to be doing walking around their community for the next few weeks. So we also split Indian Creek into 2 separate zones so that the surveyors didn't have to worry about interviewing someone twice. We targeted heads of households in Indian Creek, and at the end of this process, we got about 134 surveys out of the 174 households that are in Indian Creek. So on to the results, the exciting stuff, right? So this is looking at the levels of education of our participants. So as you can see, the majority of our respondents only have a primary school level of education. So we wanted to see how that might look in regards to their primary source of income. And as you can see, the highest ranking level of income was jobbing out, which is when a community member goes outside the village to get a job. So this could be tourism, it could be working in town at a shop or something like that. And so they're leaving their community in order to get their income. Here we're looking at different age categories. As you can see again, the majority of our participants were in the younger age categories, between 26 and 45. The interesting thing about looking at the primary source of income of these people in these different age categories is that you can see that that jobbing out category is one of the highest ranking primary sources of income for the younger generation. So the 26 to 35 and 36 to 45-year-olds. And then as you get into the older age categories, you can see that the selling of agriculture products is what they depend on most. So in a little bit, Sarah's going to talk a little bit about future generations in farming. Think back to this graph because it might bring some insight into that. So we also, one of our objectives was to look at who's currently practicing agroforestry. What are people practicing in this area? So about 35% of our respondents out of the 134 are already practicing cacao-based agroforestry. Good news for us, it's good news for Yache Conservation Trust. About half of these farmers are between the ages of 36 and 55, so that middle age range. There are still about half of the study population that's currently practicing slash and burn. So looking at the main income crops that are grown in Indian Creek, we can see that corn is still the #1 crop that is grown in this community. That could be because it's a traditional crop. Corn is often a staple part of an individual's diet, corn tortillas, things like that. But the good thing about this graph is that cacao is the second most grown crop for income. So cacao is actually being used quite often as an income crop. So we know who's practicing, we know what's being grown in Indian Creek, but we also wanted to look at that level of interest, not only in cacao-based agroforestry, but also other more sustainable agricultural practices that Yache is promoting. So there's cacao-based agroforestry, Inga alley cropping, slash and mulch, beekeeping, and backyard gardening. If anyone has any questions about any of these practices, I would be more than happy to answer at the end of the presentation, just let me know. As you can see, cacao-based agroforestry is a practice that most people are interested in adopting. That was the one that most people were interested in. And backyard gardening came in second. So about 80% of people who are not currently practicing cacao-based agroforestry said that they were interested in adopting. And the interesting part is that the 25 to 35-year-olds had the highest level of interest. So there was a significant difference between different age groups and their interest in adopting cacao-based agroforestry. As you can see, some of the younger generations are actually very interested in adopting this practice.
All right. And a potential reason, if you see this over 65 age category who's the least interested in adopting cacao-based agroforestry, it makes sense, right? You plant these trees, you don't reap the benefits for another 3 to 5 years. And 65 is old in this society. So I mean, this is off the cuff, but I would say even looking around, people in the United States who are 85, I would compare them to 65-year-olds in Belize. The way they look, and yeah, the life expectancy is shorter, is what I'm trying to say. So we have 80% of people who do not currently practice cacao-based agroforestry who are actually interested in. So why are they not practicing it? What are the challenges and barriers, which is our next question. And the first barrier that we found was knowledge. We found a significant difference between those interested and not interested in adopting, and depending on their level of knowledge. As you can probably imagine, those who felt like they didn't have enough knowledge were less interested in adopting the practice. We asked, out of the 5 practices that Yache is promoting, which do you have the least amount of knowledge about, and it ended up being close to backyard gardening, but cacao-based agroforestry. The second barrier we found was the initial labor that was required. So we were trying to get at these questions by using a Likert scale. So we asked specific Likert scale questions, agree to disagree, for each barrier. And we came up with these barriers through literature reviews and conversations with people at Yashe Conservation Trust. And as you can see, initial labor is a predominant barrier that is seen. Another interesting thing that we found a significant difference between people who are and are not interested in adopting agroforestry based on the amount of money they think they can earn, which makes sense, right? The foundational drive to adopt a new practice is going to be largely incentivized by the economic benefits. So another interesting thing that we found a significant difference between those with varying level of education, depending on how much money they thought they could make. So the people who tended to have a higher level of education said, no, I don't think I can make enough money adopting this practice, which I'm speculating that is because these people maybe have more access to opportunities and more exposure to, I could go up to the capital city, Belize City, and work as a nurse or a doctor or own a shop, and farming's a thing of the past. So this is an interesting component of this project is what is the future going to do as more and more people in these communities are being educated and moving out of the farming? What's going to happen with farming? So we asked an open-ended question in our survey: what challenges do you see when adopting these 5 sustainable agriculture practices that Yashe is promoting? And these are the main things that cropped up. The larger the word, the higher the frequency. So small livestock, people are afraid that there's small livestock where it's going to come and destroy the crops. Pests, wildlife, no land, which is a huge one. As Angie was mentioning earlier, the Maya people have a communal land system. So your land is not necessarily your own all the time, in every circumstance. Hard work, disease, lack of knowledge, again. We also did a few environmental awareness questions on behalf of Yashe because they were interested in it. This is a graph showing for the farmers who do practice slash and burn whether they think that their farming practices damage the forests and the rivers. So as you can see, as far as the rivers, about half and half. Forests, more people didn't think that their farming practices damage them. We asked, are you aware of climate change? Surprisingly to us, half of them said yes, although this could very well have been a translation issue, which I'll discuss later. And finally, we asked people, do you want the future generations to continue farming? And overwhelmingly, yes, people do. And their responses, the people who said, yes, I want my kids and grandchildren to continue farming, the main reasons were to grow their own food and because it's our tradition. And some also said because it's their only option. And those who said, no, I don't want my kids to practice farming, said they should have other jobs. So Angie and I compiled a table projecting costs for Yashe to conduct this survey in the future at a landscape scale. So we calculated we tallied up the amount of communities and figured out how many people they would need to survey with a robust survey. And based on the costs of our survey, we provided this for Yashe. And similarly, Angie, Aaron, and Anna all conducted a really great social science workshop to help Yashe conduct good social science. And Angie's also continuing those workshops, trying to set them up for success in the future to conduct good science.
All right, so we have all this research, we have all this information. How does that build upon what's already been done in the Toledo district, the southernmost district of Belize, and how can we use this information to move forward? So there have been a few studies that have been done here in the southern district of Belize. One in 2005 focused on looking at a diverse land use system and what type of system could provide the highest economic gains for those farmers. And what was found is that a highly diverse, lot of different species, integrating the shade species with the cacao, and that creates a lot of high income yields for those farmers. And similarly, a study done in 2000 focused on a community in San Jose, which this picture in this slide is actually from an exchange visit that I went to in that community in San Jose. In this community, they practice agroforestry. They also practice the traditional and sustainable form of milpa, or slash and burn, where they allow those long-term fallow periods to take place, and also backyard gardening practices. So the interesting thing about this community in San Jose is that they've been producing cacao for about 30 years, and they've created this management of cacao that actually lets their trees produce throughout the year. So it slows down production a little bit, but it provides income throughout the year for those small-scale farmers. So normally, cacao has 2 harvesting seasons. One between November and right around now, and then one towards the beginning of the rainy season in June or July. But through the management of the cacao species, they prune them, they clean their plots a lot. It's a little bit more intensive, but it's better for those small-scale farmers because it can provide them income that's dispersed throughout the year instead of just 2 large sums of money that are only in 2 parts of the year. And so looking at our study population, they're going through this process of a diffusion of innovation, so the adoption of new technology or ideas. This idea of cacao-based agroforestry is still a relatively new idea, especially in Indian Creek. So this is a theory that looks at how are new practices adopted in a population, in a community. So there's 5 different stages. The first few stages, the innovators and the early adopters, those are the individuals that are taking the initial risk. No one else in their community have done this practice, but they're going to take the risk and try it anyway. And then they practice it, they adopt it, and they start talking to neighbors, to community leaders, sharing the ideas, inviting people to their farms maybe, and then you're going to get more and more people interested in adopting or practicing. So that's the early majority. And then you're still going to have those people that are still not willing to take the risk. Those are the late majority and the laggards. Maybe they don't want to take the risk ever, maybe they just need more convincing, maybe they need more knowledge, we'll talk about later. Right now, looking at who is already practicing cacao-based agroforestry in Indian Creek, it looks like this community might be in the early stages of the early majority part of this curve. So what does it take for a person to adopt a new practice? There are 5 different stages that a person might go through when thinking about adopting something new, taking a risk. And as you can see, the first stage is knowledge. That's the one that I'm going to focus on the most because that came up as one of the barriers that people have, even when they're already practicing, but especially for those individuals that were interested in practicing or adopting cacao-based agroforestry but haven't yet. They weren't really comfortable with the level of knowledge that they had. So they need to increase their knowledge, and then they're going to feel more comfortable in adopting this practice. They're going to feel like they're taking less of a risk. This knowledge is really forming the base, and it's going to influence the attitudes that these people might have towards cacao-based agroforestry specifically. So if all things go well, conservation organizations like Yache will continue to promote cacao-based agroforestry as not only an ecological solution, but also a social solution for communities within this area. But like anything else, there are a few threats that could disrupt the progress of the adoption of cacao-based agroforestry. One of the most recent threats, the paving of the highway to Guatemala. So as you can see on this map, There's a road from Punta Gorda, which is on the coast. It goes up and there's a junction. One part of the road goes to the right. That's going towards the communities that we work in most, Yashe and Sarah and I, where the field station is based. But if you go out to the left, that's where you start heading towards Guatemala. And as you can see, the very last town on that road is a town called Jalacte, a village called Jalacte. There's a little piece of road that isn't paved, but it's in the process. So what does this mean for agriculture in that part of Belize? This could mean that more people might start practicing more unsustainable and intensive practices. So the markets for such products as corn and beans, vegetables, rice, there's much larger markets in Guatemala. So even though these people might be getting paid less for those products, they have the capability to sell all of those products. So they can sell more in these markets in Guatemala. And it's closer, it's less time consuming than having to go all the way to Gorda. And so this can create incentive for them to start practicing more intensive agriculture, such as slash and burn. So Jalacte is a good example of this village is very close to the border and how has it been affected. There was a study done that looked at the fallow periods in, I think, 10, 15-year period. And in that 10 to 15-year period, the fallow periods in Jalacte went to approximately 0. So people are no longer observing those fallow periods in Jalacte, and it's creating a lot of environmental issues because they have to keep moving into untouched forests for the soil and for more fertile land. The other threat that could happen is the instability of the buying markets here in Belize. So one example that Belize should look at is in Africa, in Cameroon specifically. So cacao is also another main cash crop in Africa, and it was a leading component in the economic growth and development of Cameroon and other countries. But unfortunately, in the 1980s, the price for cacao dropped dramatically, and as cacao was one of the main income crops for Cameroon, it left that country in a state of economic instability. They didn't know what to do, and it was very, very difficult for them to recover from such a decrease in prices. And so currently, Belize has 2 large-scale buyers. They have a lot of other small-scale buyers, but the 2 largest-scale buyers are the Toledo Cacao Growers Association and Mayaman Cacao. Now, Toledo Cacao Growers Association is actually established to prevent something like what happened in Cameroon from happening here in Belize. So they actually were formed in the 1990s after another drastic decrease in cacao prices. And they were created in order to facilitate the selling and buying of cacao in Belize. So they have a contract with a chocolate organization in Europe called Black and Green. Black and Green is a guaranteed buyer for the cacao here in Belize. So this is something that these buyers need to keep in mind, that they need to keep pushing forward on. They need to make sure that they have a plan set in place, that they have these guaranteed buyers of the cacao, so that if Belize keeps increasing the amount of cacao that it's producing, it's going to have buyers, or else the development and the economic growth of this country could be in danger in the future if prices decrease again.
So moving forward, we have a few recommendations for Yashe and for future research. The first is to use the research we did to create appropriate outreach strategies. So now that Yashe has data on what farmers are interested in, what they're actually practicing, and what are the barriers, we recommend that Yashe uses that information to develop their outreach strategies. Secondly, we we are recommending that a study is conducted to understand the actual economic benefits of producing cacao-based agroforestry. That's a difficult thing to understand because wealth, it looks different in Belize than it does here. Angie and I tried to incorporate an understanding of wealth in our survey, and after going around and around in circles for a month, we ended up deciding that it probably wasn't worth it unless we were going to do one extensive study focusing solely on that. So that's one of our recommendations. 2, to continue developing this biodiversity monitoring protocol that we have created recommendations for and to actually implement that plan. Mostly for Yashe, for funders, so funders can say, so Yashe can say to funders, hey, this is what we are doing. These are the impacts that our work is having. And for also for Yashe to work with local organizations, such as TIDE, which is an organization that some of our colleagues worked with down there. They're also doing biodiversity monitoring. So combining forces and doing work together. And thirdly, to conduct the survey that we developed over a landscape scale level across the long term to understand a more comprehensive idea of how this data, how these stats are changing over time, so Yashe can adapt their management to meet in the middle. So a few of the many lessons that Angie and I learned. First of all, setting clear goals and objectives. So this picture down in the right-hand corner here is Angie and Kenny and I back in May at the Pingree Park at the Center for Collaborative Conservation retreat, the Fellows Retreat. Kenny's colleagues in Belize loved seeing him wearing a scarf and a hat. They would get a kick out of that. But here we're doing a stakeholder analysis, and we had to, because it is research meshed with practical work, you really have to work together to create solid objectives. What are we trying to do and how are we going to get there? Especially with a nonprofit that is working on so many other things at the same time. Be creative with cross-cultural research. So as I was saying earlier, we were using a Likert scale to understand the barriers. And this is a very Western mechanism. And, you know, you've all seen it, the strongly agree to strongly disagree. And you check the box determining how you feel about the question. And the farmers just didn't resonate with this. They weren't getting it. And so Angie and I had to completely revamp our survey and try to develop something they could relate to. So we created this ladder, which the farmers use, and thumbs up, thumbs down, which is used in this society. So the farmers could relate to it, they understood it, and they were able to use this. We printed it out, and we were able to have them point at rungs on the ladder according to how they felt. Also, as far as cross-culturally, there were a lot of cultural norms that we were unaware of. We were going to develop the survey and just go into Indian Creek and conduct it, but apparently that's not how it works in these Maya communities. We had to go and get permission from the leadership. We had to go talk to the alcalde that Angie was talking about earlier, and we had to sit with him in his hammock with his kids running around for an hour and a half, and we didn't talk much about the survey, but he just wanted to get a vibe from us and then give us the yes. Also, with our research questions, as I was mentioning before, the word climate change, we had a really hard time translating that. And we worked with a lot of our staff members at Yashe to try to create a similar phrase. So, yeah, we're still questioning the robustness of that question because it was back translated to us. But it's hard, these Western mentality of environmental awareness and climate change, it's hard to translate. And finally, being flexible. This is a picture of Angie and I hitching a ride in a rice truck because we were stranded on the highway because, of course, the bus didn't come on because it was Belize. And so we put our thumbs out and jumped in the back of a rice truck with some guys. And this was just one example of many, many ways in which we had to be flexible throughout the entire experience. My Belize friends can agree. But overall, this was an incredible learning experience for both of us, to be able to work with Yashe collaboratively to do this project and with the Fellows team. So yeah, we just want to extend a special thank you to the Center for Collaborative Conservation. The opportunity to be able to do this was incredible. Our members at Yashe Conservation Trust, we couldn't have done it without them. They had developed the trust with the Maya people, and we were able to easily work with them. The Indian Creek Village leaders and the community members for being open to talking with us and sharing with us their ideas. A lot of our piloting surveys ended up just being, again, 2-hour conversations about life. Our committee members for your expertise. Jen Solomon for your amazing support throughout this entire process. You have been our rock and shining star. And our CLTL family. We couldn't have done it without you guys, near or far. And Aaron Hicks, almost all of the photos in this entire presentation and in our report were all done by Aaron, so thank you so much for letting us use that. Your creative juices. Thank you. And are there any questions? For this, Angie and I created a report. Unfortunately, we don't have enough to have one for everybody, but if you want to look through it, it just goes through our results, and it's a little more detailed information about what we did. And we also have this supplemental materials, which is our literature review, our biodiversity monitoring protocol recommendations, and our survey in the back. And I'll pass around some chocolate. I didn't have the foresight to bring Belizean chocolate, but at least it's green and black. We'll pass it to you.
I want to ask you a question, Mike.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Angie?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So my question is for both of you, and this might not be something you guys have researched very much, but I was super interested by the barriers information that came out about knowledge and labor and money earned. And I was wondering if you, in your lit review, had come across any other studies where efforts had been made to change, to get over those barriers, and the results had been studied at all, because that seems like the next step for Yashe, to try and more specifically identify the knowledge barriers and overcome them through some sort of outreach. So has that been successful in other places?
I think the main barrier that I have read about in the literature has been the economic barriers. Mm-hmm. And so that is what I saw mostly in the literature as organizations trying to overcome. As far as initial labor, I never saw anything in the literature that I read about overcoming those barriers. Knowledge, I did a little bit, but those would be really good things to provide to Yashe.
So with the economics, was that more, did people overcome that barrier by identifying how much money would be earned from agroforestry and then disseminating that back to the community that was involved?
Yeah, so much like our recommendation for the economic, the survey to understand the economics, those were the steps that I was reading. They were showing, look, these are the economic benefits you could accrue.
Cool, thank you.
And one thing that Yashe is doing right now in terms of like knowledge sharing is they're actually hosting a lot of exchange visits. So there's the recent agroforestry concession in one of the protected areas, and they were actually involved in that international cross-cultural exchange that Sarah spoke about, the tribal farmers. And what we've been doing is we've been taking those farmers who have just planted their cacao seedlings to farmers like in the San Jose community that have been practicing cacao for 30 years. Just to hear those farmers' stories, how it's impacted them, the economic gains that they've seen from cacao, and answering any questions or concerns that the new farmers might have. And so Yashe is trying really hard to kind of bridge that knowledge gap and create that knowledge as best as possible.
I know your guys' focus was on cacao and agroforestry with regards to cacao, but I was surprised to see coffee as one of the crops that they're growing, because coffee's not a big thing down there.
Right.
So did you guys I don't know, hear anything or explore that that option as based to the other ones, the other 4 or 5 practices that were in there? Because I know it's a big cash crop too.
It is a big cash crop. It doesn't grow as well in southern Belize as it does, say, in Guatemala or areas of higher elevation. So Angie and I didn't specifically explore coffee, no, but people do grow it. I mean, I remember we would have a woman come and sell us coffee that she would grow in her backyard and roast and grind on her own. But other than that, you don't see it a lot in the stores, so it wasn't something that we explored.
Yashe is also promoting coffee-based agroforestry a little bit. Not nearly as much as they're promoting cacao-based agroforestry, but a little bit of coffee is intermixed with the cacao as well.
Do Max or Jean have any questions?
You guys have any questions?
Never mind. Sorry.
See if I can get her to see us too. Okay.
Here you guys are. I can see you.
I just have a question about what do you think? You said a bit about this, but like, what kinds of education initiatives do you think Yashe could take to teach people more about the agricultural practices that Yashe wants to promote?
Great question. I think that reaching out to not only farmers but other people that might not be practicing, and also going out into the schools and teaching about more sustainable agriculture practices, such as cacao. Right now, Yashe is working on a project that is trying to create a manual for farmers, looking at integrated farming systems. And so this is something that they want to develop, and then they can hand to a farmer and say, here are some of these practices that we're promoting. Here's a manual, like a how-to manual almost. And so that's one way. Media, I think there's a lot of different outlets that Yashe can take and that they're currently taking now, actually. And like I said, I think the way the farmers learn best is through exchange visits. So actually going out and visiting a farm, not just going into a classroom and going through a workshop on how to plant cacao, but actually visiting a farmer that's doing it so that they can see hands-on the benefits of such practices.
Are there any experimental plots in communities?
I don't know if they have experimental plots, but they have demonstration farms. Like Daniel Chicken's farm that we visited as a class, that's a farm that Yashe takes a lot of new farmers, and they do a lot of exchange visits with him, just to kind of show what integrated cropping systems look like. And they have a couple of other farms throughout the area as well. As far as experimental, I don't think so.
Any other questions?
But you said earlier, Angie, that you were gonna, if we had any questions about the different types of cropping, you would explain them, and was there any that, I don't know, like Inga Alley, and is there anything that you would add to help, like, I don't know what some of these are. I don't know.
New practices. But for those of you who might not know, Inga Alley cropping is where farmers can continue planting corn, but they plant a legume species, so Inga or Brie, and they let that tree grow, and then they'll cut off the tops. When they cut off the tops, when they prune them, it releases nitrogen and nutrients back into the soil. So there's no need to slash and burn, there's no need to cut down the vegetation, and it's diversifying the system. There's multiple crops that can be grown, and the Inga trees are grown in alleys, like in rows, and then the smaller crops such as corn or pineapple or other vegetables are grown between those rows. So it's diversifying the crops, it's allowing nutrients to go back into the soil on an annual basis. Other systems, other recommendations that I might have is incorporating fruit trees into the system. It doesn't really have a name, but it can, different fruit trees can create shade for cacao species. And so they can be used as shade species and a source of income.
And something that a farmer told me about his Inga alley cropping practice, he said that the pruned materials provided him firewood and building materials. So that was a huge benefit for him, rather than having to go into the adjacent forest to collect those materials.
Yeah, and another benefit of Inga, the cropping system, is that the mulch, it protects the soil. For example, for this year, there's a forecasted increase in temperature for Belize. So that's one of the reasons why we're promoting the cropping system as well, is because the mulch that would be on the ground would protect the soil, and it prevents the soil from eroding easily in comparison to the slash and burn farming system. Yeah, I had one question, Angie and Erin. Erin and Sarah. So I think one of the perceived, one of my perceptions in farmers not adopting Cacao-based agroforestry is that the cacao they don't eat, they don't consume, and it's more of an income generation for the family. Is that something that has come up in the survey, saying that okay, they are not willing to change to obvious agroforestry, mainly because it's not a primary food source for them?
I don't know. I don't think that came up in our survey as like one of the barriers.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why we want to try and promote an integrated system. So having cacao, but also having fruit trees and a backyard garden and like alley cropping, and not just, like Sarah said, not having a monocrop of cacao, integrating it with other species. But one of the things that we did think about was when looking at do people want their future generations to continue farming, one of the things that came up is that it was a tradition. And one of the traditional crops that is grown is corn. And so I think when talking to farmers, we noticed that one of the things that did come up was transitioning from a traditional crop, such as corn, to a non-traditional crop, such as cacao. And so that's one of the reasons I think that Yashe is promoting systems like, or practices like alley cropping to be integrated with cacao-based agroforestry. They can still grow their traditional crops, and they can still grow food out of those crops and not just cash crops. Anything to add, Sarah?
No, but that's an understandable concern because not all farmers want to grow food to sell as a cash crop. So what would they do with this cacao if it is grown as for income? And that would only perpetuate this transition from a subsistence to a cash crop economy, which is another question of concern potentially. So it's a good question, but it didn't come up in our survey at all. That concern or barrier didn't arise. Good question, Max.
Well, but inadvertently, like the second highest interest was in backyard gardening.
Yeah.
Which would suggest that they are still interested in growing food.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was really interesting to us, actually. So the barriers that we were showing earlier that said small livestock, that was mostly in conjunction with people who were interested in pursuing backyard gardening. So Some of them also said they don't feel like they have the materials, and some even said, I don't have a fence to keep out the chickens or the goats. So maybe that is a barrier for them, is just not having a fence to protect their gardens from the wild jungles, creatures that lurk among jungles.
So in order to address the concerns or the barriers, is it assumed that this is sort of going to fall on Yashe primarily, or is it distributed among several nonprofits or even like the alcaldes or any of the local government units?
It's assumed that this is going to fall on Yashe, at least initially, because the project was in collaboration with them, and we didn't work with other nonprofits on the survey component. So if pursuing these barriers or pursuing the deeper understanding of these barriers is going to happen with other entities, Yashe would have to spearhead that.
Okay, I think that concludes the questions. Thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause.